Hello, this is Brian Datesman, and welcome to History of the Present. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Intellectualist, and this is History of the Present, a long-form interview series. It's co-produced with Lincoln Square, and it's about the forces that are shaping our world and the history that brought us to this moment. Today, I'm joined by Paul Whelan. In December 2018, Paul traveled to Moscow to attend the wedding of a friend. It was not his first trip to Russia. He had traveled there before and knew people there. On December 28th, while he was in Moscow for the wedding, Russian security officials arrested him at Moscow's Metropole Hotel and accused him of espionage, a claim that Paul denied. "I'm not a spy and I've never been," Paul said. The United States ultimately designated him as wrongfully detained and rejected the legitimacy of Russia's accusations against him. Paul was tried behind closed doors, convicted of espionage in Russia as an American, and sentenced to 16 years in prison. For the next 2,043 days, Paul lived inside the Russian detention system. He spent more than 19 months in pretrial detention at Lefortovo prison in Moscow, which he described being confined for roughly 23 hours a day, interrogated, threatened, and subject to constant light, and then deprived of sleep. Later, Paul was sent to a Russian penal colony, where guards woke him up every 2 hours during the night for roughly 4 years. He watched other Americans return home while he remained behind. And then, on August 1st, 2024, after nearly 6 years, Paul finally was able to come home in a prisoner exchange. But that did not restore the life that he had had before. In the 2 years since coming home, Paul's talked about the psychological consequences of being held captive by the Russian Federation, the practical difficulties of rebuilding a life after being falsely imprisoned for years on end, and the challenges related to employment, healthcare, and just typical things that we all worry about, but Paul also worries about on top of his previous trauma in Russia. And so what does this experience for Paul reveal about Russian state power, coercion, and hostage diplomacy? And what does freedom mean afterwards, after you've been deprived it for years on end? Paul, thank you very much for joining me. I want to begin before the arrest. Paul, you were going to Moscow for a friend's wedding. What do you think that trip was going to be?
Well, I've traveled around the world, China, South Africa, around the Middle East, Central and South America, Europe, of course, Scandinavia, been to Australia. So I've been all over the place in all sorts of different locations, always taking universal precautions, staying in decent hotels in major cities and whatnot. Avoiding the local food on the street and drinking bottled water, all the things that, we know that we should be doing. I thought it would be another pleasant visit to Russia. I'd been there a couple of times, and, we would see the sights in Moscow. I was playing tour guide for the people I was with because they'd never been there. And I was planning on going home, going on a work trip, and going abroad again as I did. So I didn't think that the Russian government would come after me. Generally, Westerners, especially Americans in the past, had been safe. And there's a bit of a joke. If you're in Russia and you're being followed, it's probably the FSB, so you're okay because they're keeping the local criminals away from you. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. You might be better off with the local criminals.
And what's the difference, really?
Right. Yeah. If they're not falling out of windows, right, they're on the ground watching you.
What was Paul? What was your relationship? So you had this. You're a man. You travel. You're going to a wedding. I mean, you got on the plane. You're thinking you're going to a wedding. What was your experience before going to Russia for this friend's wedding and experiencing all this horrible captivity and everything you experienced?
Well, the people I was involved with for the wedding, they're all old friends of mine. It was the groom and his family and relatives. So there were people that I knew, people from our world, and there were people in Russia that I knew, both Americans and Russians that I was meeting up with and whatnot. I expected, to go through the civil ceremony they do, to have the dinner, to do the tourism and whatnot, get on a plane, come home. And I found myself, being arrested in my hotel room, being taken to an FSB station, and then being locked up. And, I was told within an hour of being arrested that my case would be resolved through, political and diplomatic means, which means a trade. Within the first couple of days, the ambassador to the United States from Russia, Antonov, asked the State Department for a trade. And I was assured that I shouldn't do anything, desperate, because there would be a trade in sight. They said I was a brigadier general. They said I was a, secret agent for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I had gone to get minor information on FSB personnel. And, that's just ludicrous. Maybe the Russians would think that would be real, that America would send a general to get, some basic information. These days, all that sort of thing is done through the internet.
Yeah,
when our people heard about this story, they all laughed because it's not even plausible. But to the Russians, having a high-ranking American sneaking around Russia, they believe that kind of thing.
What was it like? It's hard for me to imagine. You're just there hanging out. Maybe you went to the bar at the hotel. You're going to a wedding. What were you doing? And if you can, what was it like when the first official or officer from the state, from the Russian Federation, approached you? Did you think you were being misidentified? Listen, I'm not a spy. I'm just, I'm just this guy who's here.
Well, so we were at the Metropole, which is on Red Square. And of course, Red Square is where, the big department store, GUM, is located. And on the other side of that is St. Basil's Cathedral, the Lenin Mausoleum, and then the Kremlin. So, I was playing tour guide, like I said, to my friends and whatnot. We'd gone into the Kremlin. We'd gone through the arsenal, where a lot of the old treasures and things from the Tsar days are located. We'd gone through the museums and whatnot. And we'd actually gone back to the hotel to change, to go out for this wedding dinner. And the person who ultimately I think is responsible for much of this knocked on the door. We opened the door, and he said, "Hey, I'm just here to stop by and whatnot." It's like, okay, unexpected guest, but that's not uncommon. In Russia, people would stop by on the way home from work, or you might stop and have a coffee or a beer or something. And so, changing, he's chatting. And then he basically goes to the door of the hotel room, opens it up, goes out, and the FSB come in.
And then at that moment, this isn't good.
I know something. Yeah, I know something's happening. They've got masks on. They don't have anything that says like FSB or police or anything like that. And there's a guy in a suit. So these two guys grab me and hold me down on the bed. And there's a guy in a suit.
And you don't know who these people are at first.
No, they haven't identified themselves at all. They are armed. And a guy walks in a suit and says, "Mr. Whelan, you're under arrest for espionage." And I looked at him, and he's speaking in English. And I looked at him and said, "I haven't committed espionage." And he says, "Well, we think you have." And again, he's saying this in English because the Russians know that I didn't speak Russian.
Yeah.
And, that's part of it, too. It's like if the U.S. had sent a brigadier general from the Defense Intelligence Agency to Russia to get secret information, if he didn't speak Russian or understand Russian, he could have come back with insurance documents. It's ridiculous for them to come up with this story that I'm a high-ranking spy, when even they knew that I didn't speak Russian. Everybody knew I didn't speak Russian. I can say hello, goodbye. I can do that in Korean and Chinese too. Doesn't mean I'm a spy. So from the first moment, they had translators. Things were done in English. Documents were translated in English, and it was just very obvious that they really did know who I was, and they knew that I wasn't a spy, and they knew that I didn't know Russian. They were pretty good about explaining things and maybe some of the differences in our legal system and whatnot. But they did some kind of odd things too. The FSB officers at Lefortovo, it was kind of, I think, interesting for them to have a foreigner from our part of the world that they could actually talk to about, British football, talk about American football, talk about these things that they'd never experienced, they'd seen on TV, but they've never ever really been able to talk to anybody about. A lot of these guys had been dealing with either Russian, Ukrainian criminals, or maybe drug dealers and drug runners from like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkey, places like that. So it was pretty unusual for them to have somebody from our world. And, remember, I'm a citizen of Canada, where I was born, England and Ireland, where my family comes from, and then also America. So not only did the U.S. consulate and the U.S. ambassador come to visit, but the ambassadors of my other 3 countries and their consulates were coming too. So all of a sudden it kind of blew up a little bit from, we've got an American in our cell, to, we've got this guy that has 4 countries. Coming to talk to him. And I think that complicated things for them. Me having a hernia and then needing emergency surgery complicated things for them. And I don't think they had really kind of, understood what they were getting into, kind of, bit off a bit more than they could chew. They went to the State Department very quickly asking for a trade. And then that was complicated by some dithering around in Washington. And then when Krasikov was arrested in Germany, that really kind of threw a wrench into things.
For our audience who might not know, he was a member of Russian Federation security services. He murdered a Chechen dissident, I believe, in basically broad daylight.
In a park, a city park in Berlin.
Yep. And he's then, because we discussed this actually with a couple of other guests, that what happened here, he then comes back, and then Vladimir Putin gives him this, this hero's welcome. You murdered someone for me. Welcome back to Russia. And that's obviously, that was the big exchange. I believe that was the big exchange. That was part of the big exchange, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that was probably the biggest piece. Now, let's back up a little bit. In 2018, the Canadians arrested a Chinese lady, and China said they wanted her back. When America said no, there's a warrant from America, so we're sending her to America. The Chinese grabbed 2 Canadians. The 2 gentlemen named Michael and Michael. The Chinese said, well, Canada, if you want Michael and Michael back, then you better give us our citizen back. While that was kind of brewing, Putin had one of these press conferences that he does, and they're half staged. But one of the Russian reporters asked him, "Hey, we've got Maria Butina locked up in America, accused of being an unregistered foreign agent. How are we going to help her?" Putin's response was basically, well, we'll do everything we can. And then the reporter asked, well, the Chinese have these 2 Canadians and they're trying to get one of theirs back and do some sort of exchange. Would we do something like that to help Maria? And of course, Putin said, no, we would never frame a foreign citizen and arrest a foreign citizen and then demand a trade for one of our citizens. Well, 8 days later, that's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of sniff out what they're up to. It's not that difficult.
Were you? How long did it take you to realize that this wasn't getting cleared up? You were not going to go home when you expected to go home.
Edward Pope was arrested in 2001, and I think he spent 8 months in Lefortovo. As I was talking to the different government officials, from my countries, they'd come for regular visits, weekly visits, sometimes twice a week. It became obvious that things in Washington were very slow. The Trump administration didn't have anybody that could handle a hostage issue. They didn't really know what to do. And then when the Krasikov issue came up, that kind of really stalled things. So when we got to the 6-month mark and I was still sitting in Lefortovo, the Russians were frustrated too, because they thought they'd be able to work a deal with Trump. When I was still there at 6 months, they're just like, well, this might take a while. At the 1.5-year mark, when I was sentenced, the judge, had me come back in the chambers, and he said, Paul, you're going home in 2 weeks. Don't worry. You're going home. I told you from the start, this is like the Bolshoi theater. It's a play. Everyone's playing their part. Everyone's going through the motions and doing their thing.
But you're living.
But I'm living it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the judge was actually nice and polite and trying to reassure me. And they kept saying throughout the whole thing, don't do anything drastic. Don't do anything rash. Don't try to hurt yourself or anything like that, because you are going home. The Russians were quite frustrated that it took the United States so long to work out an exchange. And, this is one of the things that we've been advocating for. Instead of the U.S. government taking, 5 years, 7 months, and 5 days, it should be 5 weeks. If we have a citizen embroiled in hostage diplomacy, if the two governments can't get along, they need to work it out, and they need to free the citizens on both sides within, say, 4 or 5 weeks, not 5 years. And Trevor was gone for 3. Trevor Reed, Robert Gilman, 4. It's way too long, and you can't expect that people, especially those of us that are a little older, not to come back with medical issues, and not to, once we get home, have financial issues and have employment issues and just have general issues that any hostage would have if they've been held for years on end.
Can you tell me, and obviously tell what you're comfortable with, because I imagine this was probably very traumatic. Forgive me, I might say this wrong. Lefortovo prison. You've said, and I've seen some reporting where it said you called it the shooting gallery, right? Can you just discuss what it was like as an American man in this prison? What was, can you kind of give us a sense?
It was built in the 1800s. The walls are 3 feet thick. You're in cells that, because of the thick walls, you can't hear what's going on in other cells. It's very quiet. It's a place that in the Soviet days, they used to shoot people. And I mean, they could still. Russian citizens hate going there. The Soviet citizens hated going there. It was the kind of place that you would go in and you wouldn't come out of, because it was a KGB prison, now an FSB prison. You were basically secluded in your cell 23 hours a day. A light was always kept on so they could check on you. The food was horrible. It was cold.
How bad was the food, though? Why don't you talk about this? No, because this is your life every day for 5 years. So what was the food like? If you had to go to the bathroom? Just basic things.
So yeah, I mean, it's a prison cell. So there's a toilet in the cell. There's a sink in the cell. We'd have soup. We have soup for breakfast, soup for lunch, soup for dinner. Sometimes some macaroni. They would have like this kind of corn mash that we would call chicken feed. They would actually give you a whole fish, like a little perch, but it was cooked or fried with all the bones and everything inside of it. It was pretty bad. I lost 40 pounds very, very quickly. Yeah.
I mean, and sort of, let's just keep going. I mean, what is it like, though? I mean, you wake up and you're in this room 23 hours I think 23 hours a day. Do you have a book? Do you get, even as much as just keeping your mind busy, and I'm sure you didn't, but maybe an iPhone or an iPad or anything to keep you occupied for all that time where you're by yourself?
So I was allowed to have books. They were English language books. They had to come from Russian bookstores. So like the British and the Canadian, American and Irish consulates would order books for me. They would come directly to the prison, and then the prison would give them to me, and I would read them. I was allowed to write letters, and I sent thousands of letters. My parents received more than 2,000. I sent letters to all the members of the U.S. Congress and Senate, to the members of Parliament in England, Ireland, and Canada, to all the world leaders and people that I could send letters to. I sent letters to journalists. Sarah Rainsford with the BBC and Jennifer Hansler with CNN, Patrick Ravel with ABC, and many others. And, this correspondence continued, until I came home. But I did a lot of writing. I did a lot of reading. You were allowed to sleep all you wanted to. But, you're in a cell. You can generally tell when it's light out. You can tell kind of the time of day by when food's arriving, things like that. But you're just kind of there, doing your own thing, and time passes slowly. if you wake up in the middle of the night, there's a light on so you can read and whatnot. But you're by yourself. You go for an hour's exercise on the roof of the building. There was actually a guy in the cell next to me that I couldn't communicate with because of the thick walls, but his name was Theodore Berg, and he was from Norway. He was a border guard who had gone to Russia, and he'd been arrested for espionage. And the interesting piece is that he and I would kind of communicate, indirectly in the exercise cells on the roof. But he was arrested in the exact same room as I was at the Metropole Hotel. So the Metropole works with the FSB to put people like us in a certain room that they can then control.
The FSB probably working there, and they tip them off, and then it's like you're kind of at their mercy.
So Theodore Berg, he was held until a trade was arranged with Norway, because the Norwegians were holding some Russians that the Russians wanted back, so they grabbed him. So they work this kind of thing out in advance. It's just like the Mexican drug cartels. It's a business.
Yep.
It's a business. And until Americans stop going to Russia, we're always going to have this problem.
I'm curious, what did the interrogators, the people who are always questioning you, accusing you, what did they want from you? Right? Did they want you to actually say, yes, you're right, I'm a spy, you're right? Or, what were they at? You're there for, I think it was over 2,000 days, right? What are they asking you that they couldn't have asked you in the first hour?
Well, the way they do things, it's a little different than the way we do things. So the SVR is kind of like the operational wing of the Russian secret police, let's say, intelligence agencies, and then the FSB guys are more kind of the ground pounders. So the SVR is involved with, say, arresting somebody that they think is a spy, and then the FSB officers sitting in their office do all this paperwork and ask questions and interrogate and whatnot. It's different than how we would do it. They don't have detectives. They have what they call investigators, but the investigators don't go out on the street. The investigators aren't doing anything out, in the real world. They just basically sit in their desks and they put all these documents together and, make up stories to send to the court and whatever. They would ask me all kinds of funny things, sometimes about like TV programs and, driving on different sides of the street. They would do things like ask me about the army. And, in Russia, they translate things and they use generalities, kind of like we do. But in the United States, we talk about the military or the armed forces. And then, of course, there's the Department of the Navy, and the Marine Corps is part of the Navy. The Army, the Air Force, Coast Guard, and I guess now Space Command, that didn't exist when I went to Russia, are all separate entities. Well, in Russia, they will just generically speak about the Army. So they would ask me about the Army in English, and I'd say, well, I don't know, soldiers, tanks, same rifles as the Marines or whatever. And they always thought I was like being, evasive. But they were asking me about the Army, and I didn't belong to the Army. I was in the Marines. So, we had issues like that. There were other things too, because they would talk about the Secret Service, United States Secret Service. And I said, far be it for me to be a brigadier general and the DEIA, but I certainly wasn't in the United States Secret Service. Well, They didn't realize that the Secret Service, which they thought was like clandestine intelligence type stuff, was actually the guys that take care of our fraudulent money and the president.
Yeah.
So I had to explain these things to them. They were using all the wrong terminology. They didn't really understand a lot of, the things that I would say, and we'd have to like translate, into words and phrases they could understand. And even the translator that we had, she was pretty good. But, I could tell that she didn't quite get like how we speak and how we do things. So there were a lot of like questions and, well, how about this? And what about that? And, why do you guys X, Y, and Z? And, we use pencils and you guys use expensive pens, or, everybody has air conditioning and, that sort of thing. Russia thinks that they're on par with the United States and that they're on par with Europe. And, Russia is really a third world country. And outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, it's really pretty poor. It's third world, fourth world. So, you get some young guys in the FSB, and of course their fathers were in the FSB and their grandfathers were in the KGB, because this is how they recruit. Never been outside of Russia. They only see what they see on TV, and they think that Russia is on par with, the first world, and it's not. And it's really difficult trying to explain how we do things. And, there are some similarities. There are some superstitions and things like that. They weren't always trying to torture me and beat me up and do things like that. But, they would come up with stupid stories, or they would try to threaten me. And I'm just like, yeah, whatever, because we all knew that wasn't going to happen, because they'd already told me that I was just being held for a trade. They tried some silly tricks, like they put a slipper under one of the chair legs that I was sitting on. So, I was kind of rocking back and forth. That's that's like a Dick Tracy type, interrogation technique. Cause then, you're kind of, you're off center, right? And it's supposed to throw you off, or, if you put the person you're talking to in a chair shorter than the ones you're in, so that, you're looking down at them. I mean, that's all Dick Tracy stuff, right? Gumshoes. They would try some of that silly kind of thing. And I would just laugh at it because I knew what they were up to. And
what was your read on these men, though? I mean, I imagine some of them were probably younger. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, what were you like? Okay, they're loyal apparatchiks. They're loyal apparatchiks to the Russian state. They're doing this job. I imagine they didn't know they could do anything else, because of you said it, with the intelligence agencies, they really recruit from the families in Russia. I mean, what did you think of these guys as people, just dealing with them on a daily basis?
Most of them were okay. I question sometimes, why do you guys do this? Why are you trying to put together a case that is false? And they'd say, well, this is our work. This is what we do. There are some pictures that are out there in the internet of, me helping one of the younger guys, he's a blonde-haired kid. His name was Alexander Lebedev, FSB officer. And I was helping him to put the handcuff on my wrist because he was having trouble putting the handcuff on. And they would take me to court. And, I'd be in the van and whatever, we get out, and then they'd put a handcuff on me and handcuff on him to try to lead me doing a perp walk, through the media and everything like that. And he was having trouble putting the handcuff on, so I was helping him. There's some pictures, like I said, on the internet about this. And you can see us just chatting back and forth. They weren't doing things to be abusive. I mean, obviously they were holding me improperly, and I was, living the sort of life that nobody wishes upon anyone, but they weren't really trying to do things that they thought were untoward. This is just how they operate in Russia. And they would always say, hey, you are going home. We have to go through these court hearings, and we have to do this and we have to do that. And, our governments need to work out a trade. And, they told me that they wanted Victor Bout, the Merchant of Death, back. They told me they wanted Victor Yurchenko back. They wanted Maria Butina back, who we sent home after 18 months, and we should have held on to. That was ridiculous. But, Yurchenko went home, and Trevor Reed went home. Victor Bout went home.
I believe he was a young Marine, right?
Yeah, he had been a Marine too. Yeah, he's a former Marine. And then, Victor Bout went home when they traded with Brittany Griner. So, Americans were going home, and there were trades being made, but the Russians at first had asked for Bout, Yurchenko, and Butina for me. And then when Krasikov was arrested, they changed their story and said, okay, we'll trade Paul for Vadim because they're both on par, an FSB colonel and assassin for a tourist. And that's the way they think. But, the way the game is played, the hostage taker has the cards.
Yep.
So, if you want your person back, you gotta pony up. And the more you delay, the worse it gets. The situation changes. They might, the hostage taker might want more. Your citizen might become ill. And, we saw this with Otto Warmbier. in North Korea.
Yeah.
And he ended up dying as a result of the Obama administration not doing anything decisive to get the kid back. And they could have. I mean, there were all sorts of channels they could have gone through and just said, look, okay, fine. What do you want? We give them what they want and we get our citizen back. Unfortunately, Otto came back and died. And that's the worst case scenario, but it happened and it shouldn't have. And we're desperately trying to stop that. Robert Gilman, close to death. You've got, Zimmerman's over there.
He was a teacher, right? Is he the teacher from PA that they were holding? And basically he was sick. He was very sick.
Yeah, that's Robert Gilman. Yeah, he's former Marine. Then, you got Zimmerman, Chuck Zimmerman. He's a veteran, former Navy. He was sailing his boat over there and they picked him up. He's older. He has medical issues. You've got Andrei Kachaturian. He's getting on in age. You've got, and he was transiting through the Moscow airport and they basically set him up. You've got Stephen Hubbard, a fellow Michigander who was living in Ukraine. And when the Russians overran his area, they arrested him. David Barnes, he's like, I don't know, I think he's 65. Hubbard's 72. Zimmerman's, he's in his 60s. These guys are not young. And we're going to run into situations where we've got more of our citizens ill and deathly ill if we can't get them back and they can't get proper medical care. With Russia's economy basically going down the tube, any kind of medical care, any kind of care and attention that they would receive in the Russian prisons is almost close to nil. So, we've got to do more to get them back, and we've got to push our elected officials in Washington to do more. If the Russians were willing to do a humanitarian trade or a humanitarian deal to get Gilman out of there, then they should be willing to do the same for the other wrongfully detained. People say, well, the Russians gave Gilman back as a humanitarian gesture without any kind of exchange or whatnot. And I don't believe that. The Russians don't do anything for free. So something was done. There was some concession made. And, if that's what has to happen and they have to lie about it, well, fine. I don't care. Do what they need to do to get our citizens back. And once our citizens are back, then we need to work on stopping others going and just protect our people.
What did Russia take from you, Paul?
What did they take from me?
Well, you had all these years, you're behind bars. I imagine you missed your loved ones. I imagine you missed just going to a movie on a Saturday afternoon, having ice cream. I mean, just very basic things. I mean, what did they take from you? I mean, because you're now in the aftermath of this and looking back, that's a lot of peace. There's a lot of peace of mind. There's a lot of security they took from you.
I had friends and relatives die. My dog Flora died while I was gone. My cat Moppet died while I was gone. My career basically ended. I lost my home. Other things. The possibility of an early retirement is done. The earnings that you would have expected, at that point in your life, investments, all of those sorts of things. Ended when I was arrested in Russia. It's difficult to get any of that sort of thing back, obviously. I knew that I would come home at some point, but I didn't know if my parents would be alive. They're in their late 80s. It's a situation where day by day you don't try to think about that as much as just deal with what you're dealing with. And then, when bad news comes, you just, you have to put that aside, kind of compartmentalize it. And then once you're home, you can deal with it. But you have to be very careful not to try to deal with it while you're there. And that means that once you come home, all this, compartmentalized trauma, let's say, it all comes out and you've got to deal with it. And, we say that for every year you're held, you need at least 6 months to recover. Well, if you're there 5.5 years, that's a few years of trying to get your life back in order. We never return to the home that we left. And, you have to kind of put all those pieces back together. Grieve for your dog, grieve for your cat, grieve for your relatives, grieve for your friends that have all died. Look at your career and see what you can do, your retirement, everything, you have to rebuild basically from the ground up. The problem is there's no insurance policy that's out there that can help you. If a tornado takes your roof off, your insurance company will put a new roof on. If you have some sort of issue with your health insurance will take care of it. If you're out of work, if you have this contingency, that contingency, all of these things that happen, we have insurance and coverage and things. When you come home as a hostage, there is no medical care or health care. You can't get unemployment insurance in your state. There are no programs that are set up to help hostages. And when you talk at like the state level, they look at you like, you're a hostage? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're the guy from TV, right? Well, of course, everybody in my community knew who I was, and the people in Michigan knew who I was, the government and whatnot. But when you kind of get down to brass tacks, they're like, oh, yeah, okay. And we're working with the state of Michigan right now in the legislature to try to put some provisions in place so people like Stephen Hubbard, who's a Michigander coming home as a hostage, will be able to, be taken care of. But you're putting your life together without kind of the bricks and mortar that you should have to be able to do it. It's almost like popsicle sticks and glue, or maybe just playing cards. And everything is extremely difficult. Look at your credit history. You haven't had any activity on your credit history for 6 years.
You haven't gone to the supermarket.
Yeah, you haven't done anything. So, and that can be good and bad. Maybe you had student loans that were deferred, but you're still paying interest. That interest is accruing. A lot of people came back to tax bills that they shouldn't have had because the Social Security Administration didn't know that we were being held hostage. So you have all of these problems that you have to resolve yourself. That's what, like Hostage International, it's an organization, it's an international organization that works with hostages around the world, including the United States. And Hostage International is really good about looking at what the problems are and then delving in to help you solve them, interacting with federal agencies and things when necessary. Mr. Coombs in Congress, working with the Social Security Administration and the Secretary of State, so they're talking to each other.
Senator Chris Coombs, Senator.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're talking about the Delaware senators,
right? So, the State Department and the Social Security Administration are talking to each other. So when a hostage is taken, state tells Social Security Administration so that we're not being dinged for being away. They'll put a placeholder in place, because if your Social Security earnings show zero for 6 years, that's a big impact on your retirement, your future Social Security benefits. The same thing with the IRS, making sure the IRS is talking with the State Department, vice versa, so that the IRS isn't coming after us when we get home, saying that we have unpaid taxes or we haven't filed, things like that. The same with Department of Education and the loans and whatnot, so that federal student loans aren't going into default. All of these things that can happen that the government can control. So we're trying to get those sorts of things in place. We're working with Haley Stevens and Alyssa Slotkin and Debbie Dingle, they're all from Michigan, on a compensation bill, which would take sanctioned funds, frozen funds from Russia and other countries, and then pay people like us compensation. Yeah. So, January 1st, actually, the State Department started offering, some limited medical benefits, including health or mental health care, to former hostages. It was written into the law before I came home, and it's supposed to be for a period of 5 years. But the State Department's having some issues with it because they're not in the business of providing health insurance to people. Congress put the provision into the law, which is really good, but they never really funded it, and they never really gave the State Department people in the SPIHA office, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, either personnel or management of such a program. So this is where you kind of see where there are good intentions, but nobody's worked out the finer details, and the end result is that hostages aren't being properly taken care of. Trevor came home with some health issues. Mark Swadan held 12 years in China. He came back with health issues. Robert Gilman, he's home with health issues. all sorts of people have come home that we're not hearing from because, they don't want to get on TV and talk about this because it is triggering. But, Trevor and I are on TV talking because we think it's important, and we don't mind dealing with, the trauma or the secondary trauma or what comes up because of us, telling our tales, because we want people to understand what the issues are and we want them to deal with them. The ever-changing face in Washington, D.C. means that you need to, educate and re-educate congressmen and senators and others in the White House and the State Department so that they fully understand, what we're dealing with.
Let me ask you this. I mean, it's a two-part question. How did you, Paul, when you learned that you were definitely going home, how did that feel? And let me ask you this, and this might be a tough question. What was your first night like back in the United States?
So, I had been in regular communication with Roger Carstens. He was the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, and I had been in touch with Julie Sunday. She was the counterpart in Canada. I spoke to the people in England and Ireland, and I had some idea that things were working. I had actually had 3 phone calls, kind of long-winded phone calls with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and I was being reassured that everything was being done. And there were some telltale signs of progress, and they were telling me things that I knew meant that they were getting close to a deal and that I would go home soon. The FSB would turn up every once in a while, make sure I was okay. And one day they turned up and asked me to write a pardon request to go to Putin. And I said, okay, yeah, whatever. And they said, no, we need this right now. And they said, you can write it in English and it can say whatever you want it to say, but we need it right now. And I said, well, okay. Let me write it. And when you guys come back, because they'd come every week or two. I was like, when you guys come back, I'll have it ready for you. And they're like, no, we need it right now. We have to send it to Moscow right now. Well, I knew that from Trevor and Brittany having to write these kinds of pardon requests, that it was a precursor to them, going home. So I knew something was up. I was able to verify that there was something in the works, even though I didn't know exactly what. And then I prepared. I got my stuff together that I'd want to bring home. I started, putting things aside that I would hand out to other prisoners, friends, and whatnot. And I just waited. And then one morning they called and said, "Hey, get all your stuff together. You're leaving."
That must be such a feeling.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, I mean, you've been waiting for it for a long time, and all of a sudden it's happening. Yeah. And I was prepared, which was good. So I had my stuff together. I handed out stuff to the other prisoners and whatever, mainly Tajiks and Uzbeks and some others, a couple Russians and Ukrainians, some Africans and whatnot. And, they took me back to Moscow. I was at Lefortovo again for 5 days. I was in solitary confinement. So I had no books. I couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I was in solitary for 5 days and I couldn't do anything except just sit there. Now, the guards at Lefortovo, most of them were the same ones that had been there when I was first there. And we'd always gotten along with each other because I didn't cause any trouble. So when I turned up, they were just like, "Oh, hey, Paul, you're here." And, they would do something funny because they're like, like we would do this to be quiet, right? In Russia, they go like this, which means people are listening or people are watching.
Okay.
And so they took me in, like when you arrive, they take you into a cell to search you and whatever. And so they did that. They were like, people are listening, but then they said, "Hey, you're here to go back." And there's another American, which was Evan Gershkovich. And they're like, yeah, they're getting people ready for an exchange.
Wall Street Journal reporter.
Right. Yeah. So I had an inkling that, I wasn't just being brought back to Moscow for something silly, that they were actually going to get us out of there. And, the guards were, they were pleased to see me. It's kind of funny when
odd though, right? You sort of get to know the people imprisoning you on a personal level.
It was a year and a half, and some of them spoke a little bit of English that they'd learned in school, and they were laughing at the prison Russian that I'd picked up in Mordovia. Then we all got on a bus. We went to a plane. We got on a plane and we flew to Turkey. In Turkey, it was kind of interesting what they did. We had 6 CIA planes lined up, and the Russian plane landed. And what they were doing is kind of separating the different people going to different countries and whatever. And the CIA planes had brought in the prisoners from Slovakia, Poland, Norway, and what have you, the Russians. And what we did is Evan, Alsu, and I left the plane and went to a minibus, like a not a minivan, but a minibus, like a shuttle bus, like you'd have at the airport for car rental. And we got on with the FSB. Then the CIA guys came, and when they were outside the bus, the FSB got off the bus and the CIA got on. And so that's how they did the exchange. And then, once the FSB guys had all their Russian citizens and they'd gotten on the planes to go back to, wherever, we then got on airplanes. And so there was a CIA plane that went back to Germany, and I think one went to Poland. And then, Evan, Alsu, and I got on the CIA plane with the CIA guys and some guys from SPIHA and the U.S. Marshals that had, the Air Marshals that had brought over the prisoners from the different countries. And then we headed home. We stopped at Andrews. We didn't know we were going to go and meet the president. I looked pretty bad. I hadn't showered in 2 weeks. I had clothes on that hadn't been washed in a while. They were clothes that I'd actually worn when I went to Russia, and they'd been, stuck in a bag for 5 years, 5.5 years. So they probably smell a little bit. Oh, but, we're halfway back and they're like, hey, we're going to Andrews. You're going to meet the president. And I'm like, okay. So I had to shave really quickly. And there was a CIA guy on the plane that was a former Marine. So he, gave me some shaving stuff and whatever. And I was like, there's no way I can get off the plane looking like this. And, I got to clean myself up. And they were all laughing like, once a Marine, always a Marine. And I said, yeah, but I can't get off the plane and look like, a dirtbag.
It looks like you just went to a party 5.5 years ago and you're still wearing the same clothes.
Yeah, I'm wearing the same clothes. I haven't shaved, and I look bad.
You've been on a really long night.
A long bender, right? Yeah. So I got cleaned up, and then we landed at Andrews, and they said, "Hey, Paul, you've been held the longest, so you're going to get off first. And just so you know that Vice President Harris is there, the president's there. There were members from the NSA and CIA and some congressional people there, and there were a lot of journalists. There was kind of like a pool right outside the plane, and then tons and tons more behind barricades. So I did everything I could to walk down the steps of this plane without falling down and being at the bottom of the stairs. Yeah,
emotionally overcome at this moment. You're in back.
Well, I mean that's the thing is I was just thinking about making it down the steps of the plane without falling, so that the picture on the internet forever was me in a heap at the bottom of these stairs. So you kind of see like I had a death grip on the railing going down, and I waved with my left hand, and as the president was walking up to the plane, I gave him a salute that came out pretty well, and then. He just walked up and we started chatting, gave him a hug, shaking hands and whatnot. My sister was there, and then, Evan came down, then Alsu, and then we were all chatting back and forth, all of us. And I'm chatting with the president, and he took an American flag off his lapel and put it on my shirt.
So President Biden gave you his lapel, gave it to you, that it's yours now.
Yeah, he put it on my shirt, so I was wearing that, and I still have it and wear it all the time. It's I talked to the pool reporters, and they're all like, what did the president give you? What did the president give me? And I was like, hey, it's an American, it's American flag. I mean, to be given an American flag lapel pin by the president like that off his own suit coat. I mean, that's, that's pretty cool. And that's the kind of thing that I'll remember for a long time. I talked to the media, and then when we kind of went down the fence line talking to the other media, there was a reporter from the Detroit News. There were some reporters that Evan worked with. There were some that Alsu knew. So we were chatting to people that kind of either we knew or we'd been in touch with, or they were from hometown. Yeah. So it was my sister was there, and she was standing next to a colonel that was like the public affairs chief for the base, and she was a colonel, and my sister looked at her and said, does it always go like this? And the colonel said, no, it doesn't. This isn't supposed to be how it is at all, because they had expected that we were like they were going to have like a greeting line or something like you always see on TV, right, where somebody gets off the plane and they shake hands, and then they walk into the hangar ignoring the media. And that's not what we did. we all got off and we were kind of in a scrum talking and back and forth and laughing and joking. The president and vice president were doing the same. They were talking to the media. We were talking to the media. We were talking to, members of Congress and NSA and State Department and everything else. And it kind of took them a while to get us off the runway, off the flight line, which was pretty funny. I think the Secret Service guys were really good with hanging back and letting us talk to the president and vice president. They didn't seem overly concerned with the way we were interacting and whatever. And I think it was a good look. It wasn't political. It wasn't overhanded. It wasn't overbearing. It was just, it was an American president, an American vice president welcoming home 3 Americans who'd been, wrongfully detained overseas. And, the media was there. They were quite respectful. They weren't asking divisive questions. There was nothing like that at all. It was just like, wow, how does it feel to be back? So the first meal I had was a steak, and then it was followed up with cheesecake. And then, I started, lasagna, and then, a good burger, that kind of stuff, just, good pizza, just those kinds of things, basic kind of American foods. And then when I got home, my mom was cooking all the British food that we usually eat for birthdays and Christmas and whatever. So I was catching up on some of the weight that I'd lost. Friends and neighbors were bringing over casseroles and all kinds of stuff. And, we had food for a long time, but it was nice to kind of, get back to normal, so to speak. And, we met the president, vice president, and so forth at Andrews. Then we went to the Brooke Army Medical Center in Houston, Texas. San Antonio, Texas. And, we spent a couple of days there, Al, Sue, Evan, and I, and then we went next door to Fort Sam Houston. And I always get that confused because it's Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio.
Yeah.
So we were there on base, and they had, there was a Navy commander that I was working with primarily. He, psychologist, but he's trained to deal with prisoners of war and hostages. And they do a debrief and whatnot. And they get us back to normal. There's the joint personnel recovery activity that works with hostages and prisoners of war. And they were just like, okay, what do you need? What clothing do you need? What this do you need? What that do you need? And they started providing things. And they were just like, look, if you need it, we'll get it. And they did. They were very supportive. They allowed friends of mine from the Marine Corps to come down, and my parents came down. Interestingly, we were in what they call distinguished housing, which is kind of like temporary lodging for senators and congressmen, high-ranking officials. And the commander of Southern Command at the time, 4-star general, she turned up, and we're just chatting away, kind of like old friends and whatever. And her aides were all colonels, and of course, the other military people there were all like, oh, watch what you say. It's a 4-star general. This is who we report to. But she was down to earth, and we just she kept asking, what we needed. Did my parents need anything? Did I need anything? If there's anything we needed, they would just get it. And they did. They ended up getting some things. But they, everybody was on the same sheet of music. It wasn't political. It wasn't divisive. It was, you're an American, you're home. What do you need? What can we do for you? And that was really nice. Then, when your time there is over, they're like, okay, time to go home. Because in the law, they only allow you to stay for 20 days in post hostage, transition. So you have to leave.
Then you're going back. Now you're in the real transition. Now you're
yeah, and you have to get yourself home from Texas.
Yeah.
So, time runs out, and it's like, okay, we're done. And it's kind of like, they're opening the door and they're just letting you out at the curb, and it's like, okay, fend for yourself. So you have to get yourself home, figure out where you're going to live, what you're going to do, all of these sorts of things that you haven't had to deal with for years and years. And it can be difficult. I've got a GoFundMe account set up that I was using when I first came home for, my expenses. But what I've been using for the last year, I've been using it for, supporting advocacy of those being held, as well as direct support of those being held including sending money and care packages and things overseas, and helping people once they have come home. So when hostages come home, I know what needs they have, and I know how difficult it is to get some things done. So by people donating to the GoFundMe, it's allowed me and Trevor and other people to help people take care of their needs. Medical treatment, getting new glasses, getting new hearing aids for older hostages, just getting clothes that they might want. Dental care is a big deal because in Russia, in the prisons, there is no dental care. There is no medical care. So, people come home with all sorts of ailments and things, and they just want them taken care of. They don't want to have to fill out forms and go through bureaucracy and have to deal with agencies that want documents and, yada, yada, yada. They just want it done. So by, people donating to us, we're able to help people with their needs. And that's been going really well. And we'd like to turn it into a nonprofit organization if we could. Because there are a lot of people being held and they do have a lot of needs. And there is an aging community out there, especially in Russia, that will be coming home soon. It's difficult when you do come home and you find that your dog's not there, you find your cat's not there. But there's always the lawn that needs mowing. There's always something in the house that needs fixing. There's always, something that needs touch-up paint or, some sort of repair. So, there are things to do that kind of get you back into that normal groove of life. You have to think about employment. You have to think about your own needs and things like that. But since I've been home, a lot of people have reached out to help, and they're interested in helping hostages that are still being held. I do a lot with the U.S. government, as well as Canadians and British and Irish, when it comes to hostage affairs and whatnot. And I think that's helpful. It's helpful, therapeutic for me to get on, the internet like this and discuss the issues that you have as a hostage, but also kind of what we're trying to do for those still being held. We're happy that Gilman's home, but we want Zimmerman. We want Hubbard. We want Barnes. We want all these other people.
They're still being held in captivity by the Russians.
In Russia, yeah.
Yeah.
Andre, he was just transiting through the Moscow airport, and the Russians basically tricked him into going into Russia, kind of through security into Russia, so he could get medicine out of his bag. And because he was in Russia, instead of the sterile area of the airport, they said, "Hey, you've got a gun in your bag, and you can't have that in Russia." He said, "Well, no, I've got the documents." And they're like, "Well, those are documents for you to transit through going to Armenia, which is legal." But because he had gone through security to get into his bag to get his medications, the Russians grabbed him and said, "Oh, no, you're violating the law." And just like with Zimmerman, he was sailing his boat, and the Russians, they came upon him and they forced him to go to a Russian port, and then they searched him, found a gun, and arrested him, put him in prison. He had never meant to go to Russia. He didn't want to go to Russia. David Barnes, he went from Texas to Russia to get his kids back after his wife had taken them there, and then the Russians arrested him and charged him with crimes that they said occurred in Texas, which the prosecutors and police and whatnot, judges in Texas said never occurred. So you've got Stephen Hubbard, obviously held improperly, grabbed in the Ukraine. Andre, David. Chuck, you've got these guys that are being held, and they're older, and they're going to come back with issues. There are others in other countries too that are being held, but Russia is one of the most difficult to get citizens back from, because they demand a trade, they demand a concession, they demand a sanction, and unless we pony up, then we don't get our people. So there's a lot of work that we need to do in DC. Hostage International helps us with dealing with the British, the Canadians, and the other governments so that they're on board. Fortunately, Canada doesn't have too many people being held hostage. Unfortunately, that means that their focus on arbitrary detention lessens here and there. It's reduced as Carney takes over from Trudeau and other people come and go. So we have to keep the Canadians on board, because they were doing a lot for arbitrary detention, and we need to keep that momentum up. The same with the British, making sure that these countries have laws on the books that allow for trades and exchanges, because some of them don't. So there's a lot of work to do, and England, unfortunately, I think we're on the seventh prime minister in 10 years.
Yeah.
So, you're constantly talking to a different foreign minister. You're constantly talking to different people. But that being said, when I was held, they were very, very supportive. And as the governments changed, they continued that support. And, when I came home, I had, direct phone calls with, the foreign ministers of Canada and England and Ireland. And, I still have calls at a high level with those countries, and we discuss these issues. And, things are going well, knock on wood. We don't want people taken hostage, but, we want people to be prepared. I do some speaking at universities and for organizations, businesses, things, especially with executives, telling them, okay, this is the reality. And if you are taken, this is what your company is going to have to do to get you back. It's not like having an insurance policy that'll pay off the Mexican drug cartels who are just after money. Generally, if someone is being wrongfully detained by a foreign government, it's going to take the U.S. government to deal with the foreign government to get the person back. If it's a little warlord in a little country in Africa who just wants to be recognized by the United States, that might be easy. If it's China or Russia, it's going to take a while. And then, Iran, they don't like giving our people back. We've got some people there now. Syria, they'll just kill them. We'll never see their bodies again. So there are some very, very dangerous places Americans shouldn't go. And, Iran, Syria, Russia, China, Venezuela, places like that. If Americans are there that now, they need to come home. And then for the rest of us, don't go. Just don't go. Stay home. Go to Canada. That's a nice place to visit.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. I want to say thank you so much for being willing to share this really historical, traumatic episode with the audience and your time, in unfair captivity in Russia and these false accusations, and now you're home and you're rebuilding your life. I just want to say, thank you from History of the Present and Lincoln Square for coming to us today and being so willing to share your time and expertise with us on this subject. And we would love to have you back, obviously, to talk about anything else related to, foreign affairs or things related to authoritarian regimes. So, Paul, it really was an honor to speak to you today, and I'm really glad you're home.
Yeah, thank you very much. My pleasure.